earlier this year. Um, Dr. Panapacker has taught at Hope College since the year 2000. Remember Y2K and all the brouhaha about that? Crazy times. Here we are again. He was formerly the Dumais Professor of English at Hope, and he is currently the Senior Director of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Programs and Initiatives at Hope College. He is knowledgeable about all of American Lit from the time of the Puritans until the present. And today he's going to tell us why Emily Dickinson matters. Welcome, Dr. Panapacker.
Well, thank you. For first, a few caveats. While I can teach American literature from the beginning to arguably the present, like any good liberal arts English professor can do, I would not describe myself as an expert equally in everything from the beginning to the present. Emily Dickinson, of course, is a figure with whom we've all had to reckon in the field, particularly those of us who work in 19th century literary and cultural studies. But in many ways, to me, she remains an enigma, as she was to her contemporaries, and successive generations of academics and readers of poetry have found her a changeable figure, someone who represents different aspects of literary culture to them at different times. And her body of work is large enough that you can find what you're looking for in it quite often. She's hard to visualize in some ways, or maybe easier because there's a lack of images of her. This is one of the more notable ones. If we scroll through these, we can see that even in her own time, she was somewhat, in terms of public consumption, prettified. An image of her turned up a few years ago. There it is, on eBay. And it's been debated to some extent whether this is actually her later in life. It's somewhat unlike the earlier image, but enough like the earlier image that it just might be her. And it seems like we're going through a kind of collective cleaning out of the national attic, finding documents and images that help to illuminate our history and our literary culture in ways that would have been unimaginable just a generation or two ago. This lecture too, or it's not really a lecture, it's more of an interactive, more of a conversation really. I want to follow this in a kind of dialogic way, so that we're talking about the poems, and maybe I'm fielding questions, but then throwing those back to you. Given that Dickinson's work is so open to a variety of interpretations. Also, I don't want to go through this as a series of PowerPoint slides, although I do have slides here, as you can see, but I also want to go back and forth between those and things on the internet, and kind of demonstrate the process of thinking about an author using those resources. One thing that has become very useful for literary scholars in the last 10 years or so, and confirm for me that can you see my screen? Can you see this Google Books Ngram viewer on my screen? Is that visible?
No, I see your edit view of a PowerPoint program for Emily Dickinson.
Oh, you don't see the Google Ngram viewer. Okay.
No, I think you would have to stop sharing your PowerPoint.
Okay.
Share the other and then go back again.
Okay.
Yep.
Now can you see it?
So you got to share screen through Zoom. So you got to do the green screen
There.
share, click, and then it should ask you which screen you want to share.
How's that? Is that working?
There it is.
I'm seeing your graph, Ngram.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to show you. If you get nothing else out of this presentation, this may be the most useful tool for literary and cultural studies that you ever find. This is a kind of burgeoning subfield called culturomics. So it's applying quantitative methods using large databases to understand how things ebb and flow in the cultural context. So if we look at Emily Dickinson, for example, on this graph, you can get a sense of how frequently her name has appeared in the comprehensive corpus of texts available on Google between 1819 and 2019. So you can see, of course, she's not really there in the 19th century. Very few people know about her. She's completely obscure, private person. But as we go through the 20th century, you see ups and downs in her and the frequency of her appearance in texts. So she's first published, or not first published, about 10 of her poems are published in the 19th century during her lifetime. But she begins to get scholarly attention towards the end of the 1920s through the 30s up until about 1940 or so. You see that bump right there. And then when World War II hits, of course, literary studies tends to fade into the background, as it often does in times of national crisis, and then begins a slow resurgence through the 1950s and into the 60s. So a graph like this gives us things to theorize about regarding authors like Dickinson. We can type in also words. A classic thing to do here is to type in ketchup and salsa. Oops, let's just do ketchup. See what happens. So you can see ketchup had peaked somewhere around 2010, and it's been in a gradual decline ever since. But if we go back to Emily Dickinson, we can see that she had a recent peak, highest ever. Some of this is the scale of the market or the scale of texts that are out there. But somewhere around 2010, Emily Dickinson peaked and has been declining relative to that ever since, but certainly more prominent than she had ever been before that time. If you look in the 1960s, you can see this was a moment or two of, say, an efflorescence of literary studies in the United States, and a large number of students in colleges where she is most often considered. It's also the era of what's called the New Criticism. And Dickinson was a favorite of the new critics in ways that Whitman never quite was. These two are often studied together too, as the kind of dyad, the dual major figures of 19th century American poetry. But Dickinson is admired more by the new critics, who were much more focused upon looking at the text all by itself, outside of its historical, cultural, philosophical contexts. And that's something that we still do, of course. We look at texts very carefully, but we also consider them now in an interdisciplinary way in terms of those broader contexts. That's what I do. I try to understand cultural history. So even though I'm based in an English department, my role involves studying history, US history particularly, but also philosophy, also religion, also art, critical theory. Many different things are brought to bear on texts apart from the analysis of the texts themselves. But the mid-1960s through the 70s were the period of the new criticism, when the text all by itself was an object of particular scrutiny. Not that they didn't consider cultural contexts, but that those tended to fade into the background relative to the analysis of the text itself. Also, this is in the 60s, an era of cultural, some might say revolution, others would say reform, but it's a period during the rise of the feminist movement and an ongoing rise through to the present time. And so Dickinson, though she was an obscure figure in her own time, became abundantly studied in the 60s during the era of the new criticism. Also in the following from the 90s in particular, but starting a bit earlier, the rise of feminist literary studies has given her particular attention. Gender theorists in particular have been focused on Dickinson's work, and that aspect of it has continued up until the recent present, though literary scholarship in the present moment has has striven to be much more inclusive, and that Dickinson, while she represented a gender diversification of the canon that went on during those years, now has become so firmly established as a high canonical figure that the displacement of such figures has become characteristic of the field in the last decade or even 20 years. So try out the Google Ngram viewer sometime if you want to get a sense of the ups and downs of literary reputation or the ups and downs of word usage in the English, in the body of English texts. So of course, pardon?
I don't quite understand the ups and downs of your file there. Does that represent the amount of her works that were used in classes, or what?
It represents relative word frequencies. So we can see the percentage of it's not absolute numbers. So it's not like she appeared 1 million times in any given year. It's relative frequencies, so that you can see this percentage on the left side, and that percentage reflects the degree to which she is represented in the overall body of texts during that time period. So what this means is that her reputation, or the amount of attention given to her work, has gone up pretty steadily since the 1920s, like stocks, with some periods of decline. In the 1980s, relative to the 1960s, for example, Dickinson was less studied. During the period of my graduate training, we really didn't look at Dickinson all that much, because the focus was almost entirely on the engagement of authors with their cultural context. So Whitman is wonderful for that, because he is fully engaged. He was a journalist. But Dickinson is a writer who is really confined to the context of Amherst, Massachusetts, and domestic life. Though she did get out, she went to Amherst Academy, met Holyoke, traveled a little bit, but her engagement with the wider culture is considerably narrower than some writers of her time. Think of Harriet Beecher Stowe, for example, who is nationally important in terms of the cultural work that she accomplished. Dickinson is not that kind of writer. Dickinson is, I don't know if that adequately answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Dickinson is not that kind of writer. And that's why she was so loved by the new critics, because of her, not because of, but you didn't have to be so preoccupied with her cultural context. You could look at her work independently of that context, or so they advocated, the new critics advocated at that time. Can you see the PowerPoint slides now? Or do I need to go back and stop? Are the slides showing? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
You can see my desktop. Okay, good. So Dickinson, just a bit of cultural context. This is what I do, where my training is to think about cultural contexts. And
Can you put it in? Can you go to slideshow and do start from beginning so we can see the full screen across?
Sure. Stop. So I'm hitting stop share.
Whoa.
And I'm hitting share screen again.
Okay.
Does that work?
Yeah, and then slideshow in the top.
I see.
Keep going to the right. Slideshow.
Like that.
Oh, yeah, you got it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So Dickinson, of course, is in Amherst, Massachusetts. In the, I'm not going to do this in sequential order, but you can see that this is a relatively remote place in the mid-19th century. It's far from the literary cultural capital of Massachusetts and Boston, but it is in an area of Massachusetts that has been strongly affected by waves of evangelical Christianity and conversions. And Dickinson is a figure who, in that, though she did at one point experience conversion to a more fervent Christianity, drifted away from it. And so religion remains a preoccupation through much of her work, as does death. She is, and throughout her life, well, like really anyone in this era, stalked by the deaths of people close to her, stalked by her own death. She was about 55 when she died. I'm 53 or nearly 53 now. And this is an era in which people are not dying with anything like the frequency that they were in the mid 19th century. And yet, even at this age, I can kind of begin to tally up the number of people who I've been close to who have passed on relative to those who are still with us. And so she was, as a writer, somewhat tethered to another world while living to a great extent in isolation in the family home in Amherst. She, of course, as I mentioned, she did go to school at Amherst Academy and Mount Holyoke. There she was exposed to the usual range of academic subjects for women in that era. She studied literary history, particularly enamored of Shakespeare and the Brontes. She was fascinated by botany and gardening. Her gardens were admired by everyone in the community. And lately they've attempted to reconstruct those gardens. Perhaps, just as much of the as her poetry is admired, there's a work in the Harvard College Library, her herbarium, in which she pressed plants and flowers. She often would give these as plants or flowers as gifts to friends and neighbors, with poems included. So it's interesting or challenging to know what to do with this. We study the poems by themselves, but should we also be studying these poems in tandem with the larger body of work that she created, these pressed plants and flowers? Back to Amherst. The family had been there for a couple generations by the time she was born. Her father was a political figure, often absent, closer to her father than to her mother, who was, by most accounts, somewhat stern and aloof. Close also to her brother, Austin, and her sister, Lavinia. Brother Austin and her father was seriously interested in his daughter's educations, but no one in the family was that interested in her work as a writer. They were vaguely aware of it. And when Emily died at age 55 or so, these poems, about almost 2,000 of them, were found bound in what she called fascicles. They were kind of thematic groupings among her papers. And they tried to get them published with moderate success. The Springfield Republican, for example, they had a friend there who published some of it. But the work was unconventional, and it was wildly edited. I mean, to make it to give it rhyme, Dickinson relied on something called slant rhyme. More on that later, but her poems don't. This is one reason she's paired with Whitman. Her poems don't conform to the standards of rhyme, rhythm, and meter that were normal in the 19th century, and so editors didn't quite know what to do with them. She often used dashes as substitutes for explaining things. Her work is so oblique. One of my grad school professors described her work something like this: that you're holding a very fancy china cup, and you take a sip from it, and you notice there's a little crack. It's just a little crazing on the surface of the cup, and you look at it, and you realize that it's getting wider and wider, and suddenly this crack in a teacup becomes the yawning maw of hell, and you don't know how you got there. There's something overwhelmingly terrifying about some of her poems, and so much of it occurs within the dashes and in between the lines. Dickinson, in the 1950s, I think would have been regarded not as a celebrator of American life the way Whitman was, but a kind of poet of existential and spiritual terror. But also passion, also questioning, also poetry about the small beauties of garden life, of social interaction, the full gamut of the human experience. But I think what she's most remembered by, or most remembered for, at least for literary historians of my generation, is being almost a Gothic writer rather than a romantic writer. a writer about the horrors, the fears, the unknowability of the mystery or the mysteries of life and how they are unfathomable. And the only way that you can capture them is between the skill and charybdis of various ambiguities. So she's enamored. This amazingly intellectual, complex woman is living in Amherst in her family house, aloof from society. As the poem, the soul selects her own society. Let me see if I can toggle back to the internet, and if that will be visible to you. The soul, can you see this? Can you see the poem? Does this poem turn up on the screen?
No.
Okay, let me try that again. I'll get the hang of this in a moment. There, does that work?
Yes.
Okay. The soul selects her own society, then shuts the door to her divine majority, present no more. Unmoved, she notes the chariots pausing at her low gate. Unmoved, an emperor be kneeling upon her mat. I've known her from an ample nation. Choose one, then close the valves of her attention like stone. So Dickinson made some gestures at connecting with other writers. Are we back on the, there we go. Connections with other writers, most notably Mabel Loomis Todd, who was in a relationship with her brother Austin, but even more notably Thomas Wentworth Higginson, the Civil War colonel. She writes him a letter. Let's scroll down a bit. Around this time, that she wrote, "The Soul Selects Her Own Society" in 1862, the middle of the Civil War. Higginson is kind of a dashing figure. He's like Robert Gould Shaw, the leader of a colored regiment. She writes to him, "Mr. Higginson, are you too deeply occupied to say if my verse is alive? The mind is so near itself it cannot see distinctly, and I have none to ask. Should you think it breathed, and had you the leisure to tell me, I should feel quick gratitude. If I make the mistake that you dared to tell me, would give me sincerer honor toward you. I enclose my name," was on a card, "asking you, if you please, sir, to tell me what is true. That you will not betray me, it is needless to ask, since honor is its own pawn." Imagine getting a letter like this. You're some Civil War colonel and you're an editor. You're connected with Boston Literary Society. Now remember, she's way back. She's out in the back country. Few connections in this realm. And he gets this letter and a few poems. I think she sends 4. And he's intrigued. The Dickinsons are not outside of the circle of the social circle in which Higginson operates. And so he comes to see Emily at the house, and she's an unusual character. There are lots of theories about what's going on with her. Is she agoraphobic? Is she simply anxiety prone? Is she manic depressive? We don't know. It's kind of fruitless to diagnose people from this distance. She's prone to eventually wearing white dresses. In one of her poems, Mine by the White Election, of course, Mark Twain did something like this too. Tom Wolfe in our own time. Steve Martin, the wearing of the white suit is in some way a kind of a badge of selection, of election, that you are, she presents herself as a kind of bride. She carries lilies like Oscar Wilde did. She speaks to people from behind doors. She's unwilling to be seen. She becomes a kind of ghostly figure in the garden of the house in later years, and suffers from vision problems. Maybe that's part of it too. She's unable to respond appropriately to people's emotions because she can't see them very well sometimes. Anyway, Higginson is intrigued by her and encourages her, helps her to connect with others in the literary world, but it never succeeds. Whitman struggled this way too. His work was considered formless and bizarre, and more than that, obscene. Emily Dickinson was asked about Whitman at one point, and she said that she never read him, but heard that he was dreadful. So even though these two are often paired, they really didn't know anything about each other. Whitman could not have known anything about Dickinson, or it was nearly impossible for him to. Later on, when her work is finally published, it doesn't make a huge splash. It's really not again until the 1960s and the 1980s that she begins to be significantly noticed. But she offers a perspective on poetry that was endearing even before that time to the modernists. This is her definition of it. If I read a book and it makes my whole body so cold, no fire can ever warm me, I know that is poetry. If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. These are the only ways I know it. Is there any other way? So it feels very much like what Wordsworth, you can see Wordsworth's influence there, the preface to the lyrical ballads, the notion that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions. You can also see romanticism in her focus on nature and her focus on extreme states of the inner life of the writer. Often her work is presented, especially from the 1940s, as a kind of proto-feminist struggle against patriarchy. And certainly there's a lot to be said about that. That while her class position, being born into a wealthy family, provided her a measure of protection and solitude, it put her on permanent fellowship to be a poet, although she had much work to do in the household. By all accounts, she was an excellent baker. She took care of her invalid mother. She was still subject to the expectations of the social class to which she belonged, one of which was church attendance, which she chose not to do. She was a religious nonconformist. So in addition to her viewing her as in a kind of struggle against patriarchal, suppression of her work, she's never published. She is fearful about having her work published. She's anxious for the approval of powerful men who control the gates to publication. She can also be seen as someone who's certainly a beneficiary of class privileges and to some extent the protections afforded by domesticity without necessarily conforming fully to them. The cult of purity, piety, and submissiveness are not fully characteristic of her, though they are partially characteristic of her. As I was saying, she's someone who is a religious nonconformist in a community where that's a big deal. And it's possible to view her life as a kind of as a private, and through poetry, private struggle to come to terms with this, with her spirituality and her inability to connect with, what is obviously a very patriarchal, male-dominated sector of society at that time. She has a kind of private mission to redeem her own soul through the means of writing poems. And you see this in poems such as "Much Madness is Divine Sense," "I'm Wife," and again, "Mine by the Right" of the White Election. Her main influences, of course, as for really anyone in this era, are going to be the Bible, religious oratory tracts. This is what she's largely exposed to growing up, in addition to nature and domestic life. She falls very clearly within the American diary tradition too. It goes back to the very beginning. Writers like Mary Rowlandson, writing in the 1680s, will spend their part of their evening reflecting on what good they've done that day, and reflecting on what it indicates about their ultimate destination, whether they're destined for salvation or not. Is my behavior sinful or not? So this self-examination, daily self-examination, is translated or appropriated in some ways by Dickinson's poetry. That rather than in this narrative linear diary tradition, she's doing something that's more recursive and complex and ambiguous as a way of capturing inability to know things finally. Am I saved or not? Her reception history, again, is one of discovery. It's a little bit like, or very similar to Edward Taylor, the Puritan poet, probably best known for the poem On a Wasp Chilled with Cold. His work was barely known in his own lifetime. And Dickinson's, of course, was barely known in hers. And then it's found and published and widely circulated. The enormity of her fame would have no doubt astonished her. And it makes you think, too, about how the vast majority of poetry is probably unknown. That, how many of us in this room have written poetry and not published it, and probably for good reason. The majority of poetry is awful, but it probably was meaningful to the people who wrote it. And so throughout New England, especially the older parts of the United States, but even up to the present, one is likely to find caches of poems written, particularly by women. Women typically are more engaged with poetry as a genre than men are in the US context. But imagine how much is out there that remains to be discovered. It kind of gives literary scholars hope, but you have to wade through so much stuff that is of marginal quality and very conventional before you find something that's as astonishingly original and complex as Dickinson's work. One thing, too, about Dickinson that's interesting in terms of the literary marketplace in which she operated is that there is a post-romantic tension between market success and literary esteem. That is, if a work is highly celebrated, and this is really the aftermath of modernism in literary studies, that if work is highly celebrated, incredibly famous, profitable. Think about Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. I'm old enough to have been taught Longfellow in elementary school, but he's utterly gone now. And Song of Hiawatha, Paul Revere's Ride, these are familiar, maybe as titles, but he's completely gone. And he was the biggest figure of 19th century American literary history. He's been replaced by Whitman and Dickinson to a large extent. And it may be that they are on the way out too. But that status that he acquired, that Longfellow acquired, was a source of opposition to him by the time you get to modernism, in which failure, in some ways, obscurity, rejection, struggling against conventional tastes is regarded as the hallmarks of true poetry. So true poetry for the modernists and going forward, maybe right up to the present, although it's getting a little bit harder to say what counts anymore, true poetry has to be antagonistic to the dominant culture. Longfellow's, it was not. It was a celebration of conventional values in many regards: domesticity, home life, the family, romantic notions of noble savages, and the celebrations of American patriotism, and all of those things were, by the time you get to modernism, not considered legitimate topics for poetry anymore. So a writer like Dickinson, who was totally obscure, writing only for herself, writing very obliquely and complexly, was perfect for what they were looking for. If Dickinson didn't exist, they would have had to invent her. And along with her, Walt Whitman. And I guess you could argue that these writers don't exist until the literary critics and scholars call them forth out of obscurity and begin claiming great things about them, and begin getting them into the anthologies and into curricula, and studied generation after generation. So it's all of these writers, the writers that we know or that we come to know, are in part epiphenomena of the critical industrial complex, you could say. And so the rejection of the marketplace in Dickinson's case, and the obscurity or complexity of her work, the need for a critic to explain it, is in part is partly related to her rise and the decline of a figure like Longfellow. She's not, I suppose you could say she's risen in a way that's not altogether different from Whitman either. And that is, Whitman is an instance of the scandalous success. His work is regarded as obscene. It has too much graphic sexual content, even for mentors of his like Emerson. Dickinson's does too. Poems like Wild Nights, for example, have fueled speculation about her personal life And much of the work that's been done on her in the last several generations has focused on trying to find out who she was privately. The film version of her fairly recently considers this matter too. They all do to some extent. And Dickinson perhaps is not completely alien in her own sensibility from that kind of speculation about who she was, because she was torn in some ways between reticence about self-revelation, staying within the home, speaking to people through doors, and theatricalizing, as we can see in that letter to T.W. Higginson. There's this grandiosity, a tendency towards obliquity, a tendency towards presenting herself as an enigmatic figure who merits more attention, who cultivates it and draws people to her to discover who she is, to maybe break through her shyness. There's an aspiration in her to literary fame that's unfulfilled in her lifetime. Why else bind up all these poems thematically, if not to see them as a kind of legacy for the future of literary culture, which is beginning to emerge in that time. By the time you get to the 1860s, the US is trying to establish itself as a literary power, much the way in the 20th century it would establish itself as a global political and military power. That to be a great nation, you had to have a great literature. And Dickinson, while not being openly nationalistic, is still engaged in the project of creating a body of work that has literary merit and differentiates itself from the work of its time. What else can we say about her? Dickinson, I mean, in that sense, I'm presenting Dickinson as a kind of an exemplar of delayed cultural work, that she's trying to achieve something, but what is it that she's trying to achieve? Cultural work has been an argument since at least the late 1980s that has aided the recovery of many obscure writers, or formerly famous writers that then drifted into literary disrepute. Probably the best example of that would be Harry Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1852. Stowe, enormously famous and influential. Lincoln allegedly says to her, "So you're the little lady who started this great big war." And it's not wrong in that it motivated people to, in the romantic way, to feel real antagonism towards the institution of slavery in ways that they previously did not, because it humanized the people who had been subjugated by this institution and changed the hearts and minds of millions of Americans and led to or contributed to the tensions that ultimately would produce the Civil War. That's cultural work. Writers like James Baldwin, others would look at Uncle Tom's Cabin. You know, you may have read this, like the death of little Eva. It's so over the top and pathetic, you know, where she's giving away locks of her hair and, you know, is full of wisdom before she's just too good to live. And this work is denounced by literary scholars for generations as an example of the worst kind of sentimentalism, but it was effective. It really had an impact on the culture, more than probably any other work in American literary history. Dickinson's work is in many regards the opposite of that until it's revealed in the 20th century, or through the 20th century, and in that process makes a strong case for the intellectual lives of women that have been obscured by the way that male-dominated patriarchal history has been done since time immemorial. So cultural work may not have been done necessarily by Dickinson directly in the way that Stowe did it, but it has been done indirectly over time. I want to pause for a moment and see if we have any questions while I regroup and move forward.
I have nothing in the chat, so if you would like to unmute yourself to ask a question or make a comment, go ahead.
I just was thinking about transcendentalism with her interest in gardening and botany, and is she not considered a transcendentalist because she's a poet? Or do I misremember what that is?
Well, I can only speculate about a few of those things, but I'll try. Um, One thing is that she's not living in Concord, Massachusetts. So she's out there on the front, almost on the frontier at that time. So it's like she's a country writer talking to people in the city. Concord is just outside of Boston. It's a short train ride away. And so you had the churches, Harvard, the Lyceum. They were all available to those Concord writers in ways that someone in Amherst didn't have full participation in.
Mhm.
So she was marginalized by that. They would not have known who she was, and I don't think she would have had the entree into their world. Even she was pursuing it through Higginson, perhaps, but Higginson was not really not a literary figure in a transcendentalist way. He was aware of them; they were aware of him. He was more socially connected to them than he was connected to them in a literary sense. But it's interesting to. I don't know. I've never read an essay that, for example, that would connect Dickinson to a writer like Thoreau, who is and of course is preoccupied with the seasons, with nature, the life at Walden Pond. And on top of that is an isolado, as the term is, somebody who isolates himself to cultivate his own mind. Thoreau never had it. Well, he had a bean field, and he killed a woodchuck at one point and ate it, and decided this was not worth the labor in terms of the nutrition that came from it. So he continued to hoe beans. And emphasized this simplification of his life. For example, somebody gave him a doormat once at Walden Pond, and he gave it back, saying it was the beginning of evil. Once you start having stuff, then you need more stuff, and it's the next thing you know, your house is full of Victorian bric-a-brac that has to be dusted, which he was against. Both of them are single. They never sign on to conventional domestic life, bourgeois culture. They reject that. Thoreau is in some ways a kind of proto-Marxist, a kind of labor activist in his own, or at least labor theorist in his own way. Dickinson barely touches on those things unless it's within the domestic realm. I don't think she was exposed to economic theories the way that Thoreau would have been as a student at Harvard. I think the connection to Whitman is clearly there in terms of the interest in nature, but Whitman is also interested in the city. He is a kind of omnivore in terms of his use of culture in his poetry. Dickinson's world she's like an omnivore of states of consciousness rather than the outside world for the most part. And what you find in the garden is not necessarily the thing in itself so much as the trigger for a more prolonged contemplation about inner states of being or spiritual questions. I think I've lost the thread. Why is she not a transcendentalist? She's often taught alongside the transcendentalists and in a cluster with them, but she's just not part of that community in the same way that Hawthorne, Emerson, Thoreau, Melville, who knew Hawthorne quite well, and Whitman, who knew Emerson quite well, though not the others so much. Maybe the one way to connect her would be Louisa May Alcott. I'm not aware of any essay that attempts to do that. It's a similar pattern in both cases of growing up in an intellectual household, somewhat isolated, less in Alcott's case, but somewhat isolated from the literary metropole, seeking male figures to approve and publish her work. And then ultimately, at least in Alcott's case, kind of rejecting that. Her early work is kind of like Gothic fiction. Yeah. And ultimately it becomes more about the domestic drama, Little Women, and the successors to that. It becomes about domestic life. But Alcott is a very different writer, though. Alcott is not so preoccupied with form or with intense states of spiritual questing or emotional struggle. Well, maybe so within the domestic sphere, but private, personal, inner emotional struggle. It makes her like the modern. She's more like the modernist. I mean, when they found her, it's like they found a kindred spirit, which they would not have regarded Stowe or Alcott as being. They would have seemed like Victorians to the modernists, whereas Dickinson seemed modern already, modern 100 years early. And so celebrating her was in a way celebrating themselves, to borrow a line from Whitman. The other, I'm sorry, I feel like I belabored the answer to that question.
No, it's good.
An answer.
Yeah, it'd be an interesting thing to research and write a paper about.
Sure, if it hasn't been done, we better check the MLA.
Oh, yeah, well, I'm probably not going to, but
database on that. This is one of the great disappointments of literary scholarship is that soon after you have a wonderful idea, you go and research it and find out that 10 other people have already had this idea and debated it back and forth and sideways, and it feels like there's nothing more to be said about it. This is the challenge with Dickinson is what is there new to say about her, and what a lot of us have been in the field have been doing with Dickinson and other writers for the last generation or so is trying not to focus on her as much as to focus on the cloud of things that were going on around her that helped to create the work that she did. To see her as part, not as a heroic individual, but as, not to dismiss that, but to see her as part of a larger cultural process in which she belongs. She's an unusual figure in her own right, but she's also a representative figure in the sense that how many other women, and not just women, have lived lives of, I don't want to call it quiet desperation, but lives of serious introspection sustained over decades. I think we'd be more likely to find that in diaries, of which there are no doubt millions, than we are likely to find it in poems of this quality. So any other questions along about anything we've kind of addressed at this point?
There is one question that came in, Bill. It says not to ask about an obscure poem, but do you have comments on, quote, "She rose to his requirement," end quote?
Oh, I mean, there are 2,000 poems, so it's hard to know. It's hard to know any but the most famous ones or so. It sounds to me like it would have been in the cluster of those that have some kind of a romantic, passionate aspect to them. And no doubt, and there's of course as I mentioned, a lot of speculation about what her romantic life was like, whether same-sex affection characterized her personality more than any other kind. But at the same time, she expresses devotion not just to Higginson but to others. Many of her letters are addressed "Dear Master." Now, is she setting herself up as a student, or is she presenting herself as a kind of supplicant, a romantic supplicant in some ways? The jury is still out on all of that. There's only speculation as far as I know.
Thank you. That's all.
Yeah. Well, Herman Melville says in one of his letters to Hawthorne, or no, it's in Hawthorne and his Mosses, a review of Hawthorne's work, that truth is forced to fly like a scared white doe in the wilderness. You only see it by cunning glimpses or fleeting glimpses. And in some ways, I think Melville and Dickinson, to connect her with Transcendentalists, are kindred spirits, and that is, you can't state the truth directly. You can't, you can't. You're on holy ground. You got to take your shoes off. You can't look at it. You can only get it through those cunning, fleeting glimpses, and afterwards you can't reconstruct them. It's one of the, I suppose, the great tragedy of Romanticism is that it's about peak experiences, about moments when you feel and perceive things with a hitherto unknown clarity and intensity. And then how do you reconstruct that later? Can you get it? Can you ever get it back? And can you get it into the word? And can you get it into words and then communicate that to other people? The problem of language is a problem for the Romantics because it's a form of mediation. And what the Romantics are seeking to do is to communicate a peak experience directly to another human being through words. But so much is lost in the use of words, in the use of language. We don't even, you write down something, that you keep a diary and you write down something that happened to you because you want to remember it. And then you come back years later, but you've forgotten so many of the details of what made that experience powerful. You only have a hint of it. So that literature is a kind of half life or half experience. It's like what Whitman said, that you're not going to take things from me. I'm going to tell you how to live your life for yourself. Finish reading this book, now go out there and live it. Emerson said the same thing, that books are for the scholar's idle hours. And Dickinson's poetry, like Whitman's, eschews the use of conventional rhythm, meter, rhyme for the most part, punctuation. One of the things that's most notable about it is the use of slant rhyme, which is like partial rhyme or half rhyme. So in this poem, for example, hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. Soul, all. Not quite rhyme, almost rhymes. But and a lot of her poetry, at least initially when it was republished, they made it rhyme. They changed the words even to make it rhyme, and they lost a lot of the meaning. Soul and all. If you look at other slant rhymes in her poems, that they give almost this quality of like minor keys, or just like slightly soured milk. You can't attain. Poetry is kind of the illusion of perfection in a fallen world. And if you make it rhyme, you try to make this perfection, you're creating a false depiction of the imperfections, the fallenness of the world in which we live. This is perhaps arguably, I would argue this, one way in which Dickinson's work is haunted by the complexity of her spirituality, that she was never able to conform and never fully satisfied, I would argue, in her nonconformity, and that she's perpetually struggling in a kind of spiritual quest for meaning and creating a kind of private religion. This is what she says in one of her poems. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright for our informed delight, the truth's superb surprise, as lightning to the children eased with explanation kind. The truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. This is what I mean by like you can't look at truth directly. You're on holy ground. You've got to take your shoes off. Tell it slant. Also, don't show your hand. Don't be pedantic. Don't talk down to your readers. Don't treat them as if they are not experiencing the same kinds of struggles that you, upper middle class woman out in the frontier, trying to figure out what it all means. If you, as Emerson says, if you delve deeply enough into the truth of your own experience, it will be highly individual, but the more individual it becomes, the more universal it becomes. So this is one way to, I think, too, to connect her to the Transcendentalists, this belief in capital T, truth. And in the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, they thought truth, you could quantify it, you could do research, do the experiments like Benjamin Franklin. That'll give you data, but it won't give you the truth with a capital T. And the problem with truth with a capital T is it's always aspirational. Only God possesses that truth with a capital T. You can try to approach it like asymptotically, getting closer and closer and closer, but you'll never get there, not in this world. And so the work of the poet is, of course, to try to get the reader, to get the author first, but then the reader to approach that truth. But again, it's always unattainable. And to lie about that, to say that here I'm presenting it to you in this form that is technically perfect and complete, is fundamentally dishonest to Transcendentalist writers or romantic writers of this sort. So the truth has to be indirect. A poem like A Root of Evanescence, for example, is another expression of that. Imagine getting, we have a question?
Yeah. Is all of her poetry, all of her writing in that style, that is with the first line and then the second line, third line match the first line and so forth? Or does she go into different phases of it?
I would say if you had somebody who was a more comprehensive Dickinson scholar, they could tell you like she had her blue period, and and that her poetry evolved from something that in the beginning was more conventional to one that was more idiosyncratic and experimental by the end. I would suspect that that was the trajectory of it. But I couldn't, there's no way I would dare to speak about all of her poetry and what she was attempting to do. But if, you know, you look at like this slide, you know, something like this, safe in this alabaster, safe in these alabaster chambers, it appears to read there to me. You know, what do you do with this as an editor? How do you have to come up with new strategies for publication in an era before you could just present the pages themselves. This is something I went through with Whitman back in the 90s, which is that the editions of his poetry have all this editorial apparatus. So, you know, they're presented in, you know, in type, but then you have this elaborate editorial apparatus, tons of footnotes explaining how it actually looked in his notes, which we don't have. And so eventually an internet site called the Whitman Archive would be created that would present the text with the editorial apparatus, but then would actually show you the page in his own handwriting, how it looked. So, you know, you could decide for yourself which version to use in your analysis of the poetry. It raises this perennial question about authorial intentions, that does it matter what the author intended? Does it matter if the author revised the work multiple times? What are we trying to figure out as critics? The intentional fallacy, we're always at risk of the intentional fallacy in this case, like saying this is what the author meant and here's the evidence for what the author meant. But ultimately intention is unknowable and elusive. And so does it matter what the author intended, no matter how close we can get to it? And are we in the end forced to confront the work itself? And is the work itself the one that is handled by the editors and the one that has been received widely? Or is the work itself the reception, what people think about it? So in that sense, we're never studying Emily Dickinson in any truth sense with a capital T. We're studying Emily Dickinson, a cultural construction whose factual reality is something that we can only approach and never know. That, you know, the ultimate subject of Dickinson's poetry, just like Whitman's, is the author. But the author, him or herself, is a kind of embodiment of universal forces circulating among all people in that time and place and culture. I feel like as usual, I've lost the original purpose, or perhaps the original intention of the question. If I could ever.
No, I appreciate what you said.
Okay.
That's good.
Other questions? In many ways, I welcome being prompted in the directions that you would like to go. Certainly, there's more to say. You know what? Dickinson, like Whitman, presents massive editorial problems. Sure, she bound them up in those fascicles, so we can assume that those are logical groupings, but they're not in chronological order. Maybe they should be in chronological order. What other way, you know, or could they be related to thematics that she never conceptualized? You know, she's not binding them together as being about, say, the Civil War or slavery, but we can find clues to that historical context in her work, and maybe it's worth clustering on the basis of what was going on historically rather than through the thematics of her lived experience. I mean, there are some of the major themes that, you know, we hear or perceive in her work. Of course, death. Maybe that is what she's best known for, like poems like "I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died," "My Life Closed Twice," "Because I Could Not Stop for Death, He Kindly Stopped for Me." And then garden life, nature. "I taste a liquor never brewed. A bird came down the walk, a narrow fellow in the grass." And then, of course, religion. "Faith is a fine invention. I never lost as much but twice. The world is not conclusion." Those are three major themes in her work, but certainly we can find others. One question that has occurred to me, and I raised it already, is how to think about her in terms of genres of romanticism. And we already talked about, is she a transcendentalist or not? She's only in a complex way. Is she a sentimentalist? Probably not. Um, she's not dealing with conventional emotions and pieties. Or it's hard to find any evidence of that in her poetry, though perhaps maybe in her letters. But how do you, do you know if she is always being authentically herself in those letters, or is she trying to present herself in a way that will get the response that she wants from her reader? Is one way of defining Gothicism as opposed to sentimentalism. Sentimentalism is about love, right? It's when we think about romanticism, in conventional culture, it's typically about love of two partners, the feelings that they have and express for each other. So sentimental love of a parent for a child is characteristic of sentimentalism. Gothic writing in some ways is romantic too, because it deals with the spiritual plane. It's not about reality or realism or matter. It's about higher things, higher sensibilities. There's always a kind of God in the background of romanticism, whereas the Enlightenment had deism, a kind of deus abscondus, an absent God in the background. Romanticism has a God that's very much in the present and affecting the way that we interact with each other and with nature. So sentimentalism is going to focus on those powerful feelings of love that humans have for each other, and the tragedy of love being destroyed. For example, your child being sold south, in the case of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and we are asked to feel the pathos of that for Eliza, the mother of this child, and to root for her escape, even though we, as good citizens might have supported the Fugitive Slave Act in that era, thinking it's all the best for keeping, the peace in the United States between the North and the South. But confronted with this emotional atrocity, our hearts and minds are changed. The Gothic does something similar in the sense that it is about human emotions, just like all of Romanticism, but it's about solitude and loss, the inability of humans ever to fully connect with each other, that ultimately we're alone. We live alone, we die alone, we'll never understand anyone else fully. And love is an illusion. It's something to be yearned for, but ultimately love is unattainable because we can never know anyone any more than we even know ourselves. And Emerson wrote an essay after his son Waldo died, as he was 5 when he died. And Emerson said, in some awful way, I don't grieve because it was not me. It's like I've lost an estate, but I haven't lost myself. And so on the flip side of this coin of sentimentalism and this romantic oneness, writers like Whitman will celebrate things like, he'll give you a long list of all these different kinds of trades of people doing things in the city and the country. He'll say at one point, I see a horse car conductor. I love him, though I do not know him. He's trying to build a kind of nationalist connection, an imagined community in a time of great disagreement with regard to race, ethnicity, religion, and so on, especially in places like New York. I don't think Dickinson is ever trying to it doesn't believe that you can ever overcome overcome the distance between yourself and other people. You can't. And so to be alone is ultimately the state of human beings. And so what she's done is enact that in her life to a great extent, to be alone and to explore what it means with great courage, versus those who might say, in a kind of codependent way, arguably, that my work is about my sentimentalism, my romanticism is about connecting with other people, and that way I don't feel alone and lost. But the Gothic writer is always alone. The Gothic writer is frozen in the, at the bottom of Dante's Inferno, like Lucifer. You'll never be able to overcome that. And if that's the case, what do you do? What do you write about? And that places her, from my point of view, in the category of Gothic writers, more like Poe, who is by no means a transcendentalist. I'm sure he's aware of them, but his work, though it's ostensibly about terror, is also about that problem of the inability to connect with other human beings. that we're all kind of on the table in the pendulum, or Roderick Usher in his decaying mansion that's about to sink into the black and lurid tarn, leaving nothing but an indelible image of horror in the fleeing narrator. Let me stop there and see what we have, whether we have thoughts and questions. Before going, we can go to some of the poems.
Do you know if she had any favorite writers that influenced her?
If so, I don't believe she said. The literary historians and biographers, as I mentioned, find the Bible, of course, influencing her very strongly. Sermons, the Brontes, perhaps Jane Austen. She certainly looks to women as literary forebears, rightly, in this period. Shakespeare, especially. It was impossible to escape the influence of Shakespeare in American literary culture at this time. I suppose after Shakespeare, who are the biggest figures from outside? Sir Walter Scott, Robert Burns, although I don't see the influence of those two in her work.
Has her work been in the rhyme, or not the rhyme so much as the rhythm, I guess, been influenced by hymns, hymnody? I think I picked up somewhere that she maybe has absorbed some of that from hymns, although she didn't go to church much.
I would say almost definitely. Teachers of Dickinson often will sing her poetry as if it were the Yellow Rose of Texas. And it works. So it's not, she is not so formally unconventional as Whitman, in that there is rhythm to it, like that, rhythm and meter. But she'll often break it as a way of communicating a point, because if you do that too perfectly, you're communicating something about the nature of the world that is really different from what Dickinson would espouse. Now I want to get out of this, out of the PowerPoint slides, and take you back to the poetry. So I'm going to stop sharing that and then go back to the internet, and hopefully you can see that. This is.
Do you have favorites among her poems?
Yeah, I guess I like the Gothic ones. Here, I'll click. One of my favorites, of course, is Because I Could Not Stop for Death. Can you see this on your screen?
Yes.
I'll read it, and we can maybe reflect on this one together. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I'd put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun, or rather he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill. For only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. Just made me think of the end of Poe's The Cask of Amontillado, where he says, for the past half a century, no mortal has disturbed him. Don't know if Dickinson read Poe. It'd be interesting to look into that. This idea of death as a gentleman caller, like, she's been waiting around in that house forever. And the suitor finally arrives, and it's death. It's and the details of this too, with clothing, with the oblique references to the grave that she's heading for, the description of it. It's a strongly visual poem, and you compare it with. Let's find some others. This is from, by the way, the Academy of American Poets website, where you can find all kinds of biographical information. as well as a collection of these poems, which are mostly in the public domain. Those some of them have been edited in such a way that they are not quite available yet. Oh, of course, I felt a funeral in my brain. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, the service like a drum kept beating, till I thought my mind was going numb. Just sidebar here, I'm hearing the telltale heart in this. If you know that story about the murderer who conceals the body beneath the floorboards, but is forced to confess by his delusion of the heart still beating. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll as all the heavens were a bell and being but an ear, and I and silence some strange race wrecked solitary here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down and down and hit a world at every plunge and finished knowing then. And it just ends. So it's death as the obliteration of consciousness, the unknowable, the unknown, the ultimate unknowable. This is the era. When is the Gates Ajar is published not far from this time. It's soon in the aftermath of the Civil War. This is a way too you can connect Dickinson to her time, and that this is a period not that different from ours, in which about 700,000 people died during the Civil War. Nearly everyone was affected by it. Everyone's struggling to come to terms with grief. The meaning, what does it mean? She says this about her father after he dies. She struggles with what it means not to have consciousness. What is it? How can one be without consciousness? It's that feeling. I remember this when my own father died in 2006. This feeling, where did he go? Where did all that knowledge and life, where did it all go? And there are lots of answers provided by faith for that. But if you're a person who struggles with it, how do you come to terms with this reality for other people, but even more so for yourself? So I think that as a poet of death like Whitman, she's almost incomparable. There are others that perhaps we can find in this list. But I'm standing by too for questions and observations. It's not all death, of course. Oh, of course, we need to look at this one. I heard a fly buzz. And this is so spooky in a way. It's like Whitman, at the I think it's Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. He says, just as you look, I looked. Just as you leaned against the rail, I leaned against the rail. How do you know that I am not looking at you now? Like Whitman is always projecting himself into the future. And then here's somebody talking after they're dead. It's a ghost story. I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. The eyes around had wrung them dry, and breaths were gathering firm for that last onset when the king be witnessed in the room. I willed my keepsakes signed away, what portions of me be assignable. And then it was, there interposed a fly with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and me. And then the windows failed, and then I could not see to see. Again, it's about that obliteration of consciousness. There is apparently still something going on. The narrator is still here describing death, but what does it mean to have your consciousness vanish? Who are you? Do you, if you are not it's like you're not even yourself. If your consciousness and your experiences are erased at the moment of death, and you are just a soul, a spirit, are you anymore? Or are you something else? And how can you know? How do you come to understand this as a living human being? Well, these are her attempts. Let's see.
Slant of light, certain slant of light.
All right, a certain slant of light, which
It was just on there.
Previous one.
Just, yeah.
Yeah, we could talk,
Yes.
we have a few minutes to talk about this one too. Okay, I'll read it and then we can reflect on this one too. There's a certain slant of light. I'll throw in some random thoughts on this as I go through. One is there's something about the light in New England that's different from anywhere else I've ever lived. I lived there for 7 years. And in the fall, when the leaves change, there's something very melancholy about it all. On the eve of winter, it's like the twilight years, and there's something about that light that calls forth just a feeling of melancholy and yearning that is beyond words. But this, I think, is trying to get at it. There's a certain slant of light winter afternoons, the long shadows of that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us, we can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are. None may teach it any. 'Tis the seal despair, an imperial affliction sent us of the air. When it comes, the landscape listens, shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. Very Gothic ending too. It's a nice companion to the other poems. It seems like a nature poem, and then it turns into a Gothic poem by the end. There's a theory of correspondence that Emerson writes about in his long essay, Nature, too, that the way that we see the world is often not how it actually is, but it's a reflection of our internal states. So if you're feeling sad, then what you see in the natural world reflects that sadness back to you. It affirms it. If you're feeling happy, then you see what you want to see. So that for the romantic, the outside world is a reflection of the inside world. And for Dickinson, it's one that seems often preoccupied with the transitoriness of life and the unknowability of death. A heavenly hurt. And yet it's kind of a what would you call it, a dialectic or a dissonance there. Heavenly hurt. That feeling of joy and pain, that grief is somehow pleasurable. That because you're feeling something. Your grief doesn't come from indifference, it comes from love. And loss. And so what Dickinson is not as frequently going to write about, the joys of passion and love. She's going to find that in the tension or in the feelings of loss. And this poem suggests that to me. I don't know, other thoughts on this one?
The slant of light reminds me of some of the paintings of Andrew Wyeth. Is he from that area?
No,
you know who I'm talking about?
I
No?
do know who you're talking about. That's like Christina's World, and yeah,
Right.
that is a great connection to Dickinson. Wyeth is from the Brandywine Valley outside near Philadelphia. So he's a Pennsylvania artist, and I believe he's working mid 20th century, like from about 1920 to 1960 or thereabouts. But yeah, there is a wonderful connection between them, and we think about other like visual analogs for Dickinson. It's hard to think of a better one. So that's great.
I'm so glad that she wrote these down rather than just simply go to a therapist and talk.
I can't argue with that, although from a literary standpoint, on the other hand, she might have been a better adjusted person had she had a sounding board other than her poetry for whatever inner struggles she was facing. Other ones, like what are your, let me throw this out to the room. What are your favorite Dickinson poems? It's likely that you're here because you have a few. Here's another one, Sis from Lead and Sieves. Think about this as like flour, sifts from leaden sieves. It powders all the wood. It fills with alabaster wool the wrinkles of the road. As maybe Robert Frost is a competitor in the description of snow. It makes an even face of mountain and of plain, unbroken forehead from the east to the east again. It reaches to the fence. You imagine her looking out the window and seeing this happen. It wraps it rail by rail till it is lost in fleeces. It deals celestial veil to stump and stack and stem. A summer's empty room, acres of joints where harvests were cordless but for them. It ruffles wrists of posts and ankles of a queen, as ankles of a queen. Then stills its artisans like ghosts, denying they have been. What can we say about this? The interesting, it's another one with dashes. Why are they there? Suggests a kind of incompleteness, almost like a trailing off, like of the ineffable. There's more that can be said, but it's beyond the reach of words. As like characteristic of Dickinson is this again this refusal to see language on the page as adequate, and that it more can be suggested by what isn't said than by what is said. It's a paring down of the poem to the least that needs to be there. So different from Longfellow, and Whitman, who are going to write these epic poems of many thousands of words. Walt, couldn't you have just gotten it down to 120 words? Probably could, but on the other hand, the adventure of going through all of Whitman's poetry is meant to replicate the experience of experiencing America in the 19th century. But this does it too, and it does it like the immensity and grandiosity of someone like Whitman compared to Dickinson. They are such opposites, and Dickinson is about, there's a kind of something deeply New England about her that Whitman could never understand. And could never replicate in his work. Whitman is about the effusiveness, somebody who wants to talk to you and grabs you by the collar and gets right up and shouts in your face. And Dickinson is just quietly, kind of stealthily waiting for just the right stiletto word that you'll never forget. That's what I mean. I think in the end, not being a literary formalist, not being a new critic, but being a cultural historian who likes to situate works in biographical and historical contexts. What I admire most about Dickinson is the mot juste, finding precisely the right word. You read it and you think, not on the best day I ever had would I have chosen that word, and it's perfect. Well, we're getting towards the end here.
Okay, I want to add one thing, and it has to do with relevance for today, perhaps. I was surprised and delighted to know that the church that I am a member of has selected as its Lenten study studies based on meditations based on some of the poems of Emily Dickinson. That was the use for our devotional for Lent at Hope Church here in Holland. And I thought, well, that's very timely, and we're studying her right now.
Well, yeah, and I guess she might be surprised by that, to see her poetry accepted in a religious context, since she felt herself kind of an outcast in that regard. Sure. And yet, what was Dickinson's life but one almost like of monastic spiritual devotion, and standing firmly against conformity in a community where religion was a kind of gateway to respectability, rather than a passage to reflection about the meaning of life in any very serious way.
Ever since you told us about Yellow Rose of Texas, now I gotta like hum it in the back of my mind while I'm while I'm reading the poems. So I just had to Google Yellow Rose of Texas, and you probably know this, but the tune is a Confederate Civil War song,
Huh.
which makes me think the cadence is was there something in the air?
Yeah, I was not aware that that was a Civil War song. I think I remember it more from the 20th century somehow.
Yeah, it's the tune, not the
Miller made it popular in the mid-50s,
right.
but it's
Yeah.
it's a good marching song.
Hoyt Axton.
I didn't quite understand the Yellow Rose of Texas one because it's not quite what they used to call ballad stanza. Like ballad stanza would be something more like a mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing, a shelter he amid the flood of mortal ills prevailing. 4, 3, 4, 3, 4 beats, 3 beats, 4 beats, 3 beats, you know, like that. And she fits, some of her poems fit that. But then she seems to not be rigid about the rhythm either, so it doesn't really do that so unto itself. But this poem doesn't do that at all.
Mhm.
It's this poem is more wispy than a ballad. But the soul standing in awe of itself is just beautiful. The soul should stand in awe of itself is just a beautiful poem. She wasn't so depressed that day.
Yeah, it's almost like, you know, Blake finding the universe in a bleak band, or Whitman saying, a mouse is miracle enough to stagger sextillions of infidels. Like sometimes in the right frame of mind, there's beauty everywhere. So much so you can barely stand it.
But even to go back to that last line of the poem where she tumbles down from world to world and finished knowing then, finished could mean perfected. I mean, maybe that doesn't fit the poem as a whole, but if you finish something, it's the new level of knowing, like now we see through a mirror dimly, but then face to face. And so you come to a new place outside the whole zone.
Is that the sort of the ultimate is when you're beyond the need for language, because
Yeah, and then I could not see to see, it represents the other type of seeing that's completely divorced from a human way of seeing, or completely divorced from rationality, but still the ghost is there saying from another standpoint, I could not back then see to see, but here he is speaking of it, as you said, the ghostly like presence is there making the utterance.
yeah, it's
So
like
almost sort of turn it over.
language itself is a form of brokenness.
Mhm.
It's a flawed medium that we're using.
Yeah.
We can't escape from it except through death. And perhaps what lies beyond that is a universal, comprehensive, perfected understanding without words.
Like
But-
Dante at the end of the Paradiso.
I'm pretending to know what you're talking about. Well, I think we're at 2:30, and I promise not to continue beyond that time. But thank you all for listening. I hope you.
Thank you.
I hope this in some ways gave you some new insights into Dickinson.
Well, I'm sure that we all want to go read more Emily Dickinson now. I feel kind of reinterested in her. So thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Thank you.
You're
Yes,
very welcome.
thank you very much. It was great.
Very much.
Oh, thank you.
I feel very non-smart, but it was wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, goodbye,
Thank
everybody.
you. Thank you.
Thanks for reading the poems and showing us the poems.
Thank you.
Yeah, sending them, yes.
I'll stick around. I think a couple.
Kim might need to do something for you before you sign off. I'm not sure.
I still have a question for you, William.
All right, I was on the phone. I'm here.
Okay.
Great class, beautiful poems.
Yeah.
I don't
Are
have
we-
anything else in the chat.
Kim, are we all set?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, good.
Okay, is this a good time for me to ask the question?
Yeah.
Thanks
This
so
is
much.
one that has to do with Walt Whitman. I just finished studying, reading the
Moby Dick.
Moby Dick.
Oh.
Yeah, the words don't come. Moby Dick, and toward the end of Moby Dick, in two of the last chapters, one is the symphony and the other one is the chase, the third day. There appeared the phrase, "Oh, my captain, my captain."